But yeah, this third one on China will be on the test also. So we'll try to get through it as quickly as we can. So we're going to cover the last three major dynasties and then talk about some more kind of economic things about China in this very late period. I mean, we're going further with China than any other civilization we've talked about so far. I mean, getting close to 1,000 years after zero. So we'll start with the end of the new kind of civil wars in the 500s and move up from there. We saw this slide last time, this kind of breakdown of just a massive amount of chaos that goes on for 370 years. This massive amount of infighting between all these different families and all these different regions. And to end it very quickly, basically there's one guy who's calling himself an emperor in this northern kind of area. And there's a very successful general in that northern area who this general convinces the king of his area to marry the general's daughter. So, and this is just a military advisor to the king, and convinces the king to kind of build a relationship with the general's family so that the general's grandson will be heir to the throne of this one kingdom. Does that make sense? No? He's intermarrying his daughter with the king to bring the two families together. And then when the king died, the grandson, who's a little kid, becomes the next king. And this general is appointed the regent, the head of the regency council, to run this government. And so he's like head advisor for a while, and then he just overthrows his own grandson, claims the mandate of heaven for himself, and then goes out over about the next 10 years or so and reconquers most of the rest of ancient China piece by piece by piece through pretty brutal means. And when that is finally accomplished in 589, he announces himself as the emperor of reunified China under what he calls the Sui dynasty. And he takes the throne name of Wen Dai. So he's already an older guy by the time this reunification is completed. So he's on the throne as the head of this new dynasty for about 15 years. Does that all make sense?
What did he do with his grandson?
I pushed him aside. I think when Wen Dai died, his own son, not the grandson's generation, but the daughter's generation, becomes the next king of the Sui dynasty. And that guy doesn't do a very good job. But Wen Dai is a very popular kind of figure in Chinese history. Another thing that Wen Dai accomplished, or at least his government accomplished under his leadership, is to build a giant canal to connect the two major rivers, the Yellow and the Yangtze rivers, and even go a little bit further than that, all the way to the ocean eventually. But this is a gigantic building project, the size of which hasn't been seen since the Han Empire. So this is 400 years, the biggest government spending kind of project, biggest alteration of the landscape in centuries, and becomes known as the Grand Canal. It's very wide and very deep. Wen Dai justified this as this will allow boats to travel from north to south consistently instead of east to west, which was their major transportation route, because that's the way the rivers ran for the most part. So this, he said, would allow people to move around and especially move farming goods, food, north and south much easier through ancient China. Other historians argue that he also wanted to build this thing because it was useful for moving troops. Remember, he's just been at war amongst the many different kings for a long, long time. So he may have built it also to move soldiers around in order to control various different regions, keep other landowners pretty much under his thumb. Does that make sense? And there's it's about 1,000 miles long. Here's a kind of computer rendering of what it might have looked like back then. And I mean, the areas around the Yellow Yangtze rivers are already pretty built up. They have fairly large cities by that point. So in some places, they're bulldozing right through the middle of a town or a village or a city, wherever they felt the canal was, most useful to be built. So in some places, it goes through densely populated areas. And this is what it looks like today. So it's very wide and very deep. It gets even modern boats through. You can see there's like walkways and roadways along the side of it. But these little kind of lips along the sides, these are people. So that's the scale you can use just to look at the size of this thing. And again, going for 1,000 miles, that's a long, long ways. It's about twice the distance from Los Angeles to San Francisco. And remember, they're not building this thing with cranes and bulldozers, right? They're doing it with buckets and shovels and slightly higher level technology than that. But this is a huge amount of labor. It takes several years. So it's one of these building projects that, when it's announced, a lot of people thought, it's just too ambitious. It can't be done. Again, whenever you get government money behind you and government kind of dedication to resources and time and energy and whatnot, they can do amazing things when they decide to. Does that make sense? All right, so that's the canal. Wu Dei died in, 604? Yeah, somewhere around there. Reportedly, the story is that his son, the inheritor of the throne, just wasn't very efficient, didn't seem to really care too much about governing China, was known to throw big lavish parties and spend whole weekends at his countryside residence where these parties would take place, and has no desire to actually be involved in the administration of government. So the government efficiency just kind of collapses when this guy gets to the throne, and angers the people so deeply that by 616 or so, you get a lot of other people, big landowners especially, wanting to take down the government, replace it, usually with themselves. The probably most efficient, best kind of landowner and governing his own little kingdom is named the Duke of Tang. And he quickly claims the mandate of heaven in 618 and basically takes down the Sui government, replaces it with his own leadership. And this becomes known as the Tang Dynasty. That will last for quite a while, a few centuries. So again, you basically have this statement that the Sui government had grown corrupt and inefficient and was not, running the place for the benefit of the average Chinese people. The courts and justice have kind of gone downhill, so people are angry, and they use that theory to rise up and revolt. The Duke of Tang is actually an older guy when all this happens. And historians often argue that the Duke himself, the big landowner, wasn't really interested or didn't really want to get involved in this conflict. And it was one of his very young sons, who eventually becomes known as Taizong, who convinced his father to get involved in these wars and try to become the next emperor, start a new dynasty. So it's this young son who we estimate is probably only about 18 years old when he convinces his father to get involved. And the son actually, as an 18-year-old, leads his father's armies in several battles against other Chinese landowners to see who's going to, win out and lead the next dynasty. So this young son is extremely ambitious. And once his father kind of instituted control, the son seems to have spent several years knocking out all of his older brothers, the logical inheritors of this new throne, attacking them, killing some of them, throwing others in jail, kicking others just out of the country, in order to eliminate all the kind of primary heirs to the throne so that he himself could be the heir to his father's throne. Does that make sense?
What was his father doing during that time?
He's king. Well, a lot of kings, they don't really run the place themselves. They rely on their advisors, right? And so this guy, his youngest son, is his head advisor, even though he's very young. So a lot of kings are just kind of king in name only. They're not making the big decisions. They're just kind of signing off on the final thing. Does that make sense? So just like I'm sure you guys have office jobs or something, you have bosses who don't really understand what's going on, but you need their signature on the paper to get stuff done. Yeah.
What does his dad do for 8 years watching all his sons get murdered?
Apparently, some historians argue that the father is actually very afraid of the son.
True.
And kind of looks the other way while this is going on. But eventually, through one way or another, he knocks all the other heirs to the throne out. And really the moment, or a few days, after the father names this guy the official heir to the throne, he forces the father to retire. That's what abdicate means. Abdicate is when a king or an emperor or something signs an official document that says that they don't want to be king anymore and they're passing it off to the next generation. So now this guy is the new emperor and he takes the name Taizong. He's only about 26 years old. So from a very young age, he's very ambitious and cutthroat even against his own family. And that's how he gets there. And he does I can never remember exactly why he dies. I always have to look that up. But he dies at about only 50 years old. Which isn't, it's like middle age, but people back then, if you made it beyond about 8 or 10 years old, they tended to live pretty long. The average lifespan of people in the ancient world is like, in your early 40s or something. That's when people on average died. But that is impacted because so many children died at a very young age. Newborn babies. Does that make sense? Because they're fragile. So, if you had 6 kids, you would be lucky if 2 of them survived to be 10 years old and survive into adulthood.
So like the numbers are skewed, so really the people were living longer. Okay.
Yeah, so if you get beyond kind of early childhood, you have a pretty good chance of making it into, say, your 60s or maybe 70s, as long as you're not killed on a battlefield or killed by a plague or something like that. So yeah, the population, the average lifespan is really skewed because so many children died at such a very, very, very young age. And mothers, too, when they give birth, the childbirth is a very dangerous thing in the ancient world. A lot of mothers died in childbirth and in just the days after, loss of blood or getting an infection or something. And it still happens in a lot of places in the world that don't have modern technology. Childbirth is extremely dangerous up until about 100 years ago, when you get hospitals with electricity and they can have monitoring machines and all kinds of things for the mother. So in places that don't have those resources, childbirth is still extremely dangerous. So that's Taizong. But he does other important things in the rest of his time on the throne. Number 1, again, he's very ambitious. He builds up a large Chinese army and launches an invasion to a place that China hadn't really ever conquered or controlled before. Launches invasions all the way out into, on this map called Turkestan, and conquers the place pretty outright and dominates, controls those people and their land for many, many years.
What is that area today?
Well, it's north of Tibet. You still hear the word Turkestan used as kind of regional definition, but today China spreads all the way out to here. So that might take in a big chunk of what is generally called Turkestan. But I think Russia might be down that close even today. And I have to look on a modern map. The Soviet Union during the Cold War was much bigger than Russia is today, so it had a lot of smaller countries, especially along the southern and southwestern areas.
Turkmenistan or whatever it is.
Yeah.
Kazakhstan.
Yeah.
I think Kazakhstan is even further west of here, if I remember right. But again, I'd have to look on a modern map. After about 1992, when the Soviet Union collapsed, the map really changed pretty dramatically, and a lot of smaller countries that the Soviets dominated got independence. I mean, real independence. They actually get to govern their own place, whereas the Soviets just controlled them for a long time. So, yeah. But today's China, they have since, and I think in the 1950s, they conquered Tibet. So China today stretches pretty far west, right up to the edge of India. But conquering Turkestan back then, you see on the map, it virtually doubled the size of their territory. And that's a lot of land suddenly available. And remember, the Chinese have been fighting each other over this land in their own homelands for century after century after century. And now there's just suddenly a huge amount of, when you conquer a place, you usually kick out the local landowners and it's land for sale or for auction. Real estate's a big, big business. And it provoked people to attack foreign places before just to get more land to sell to the rich people in their homeland. Does that make sense? And you see that in the Americas eventually too. When the Europeans come in and wipe out a few 100 million natives and take over that whole place for themselves.
100 million.
Hundreds of millions, yeah. When the Europeans...
That was a culture exchange. They actually killed that many people.
Yeah. Well, not always through warfare, but oftentimes through disease. But they use disease as what we today call biological warfare, and take disease and try to spread it amongst the enemy and kill them off. But yeah, it's estimated when the Europeans made contact with the Americas.
90% of the population or something crazy like that.
Well, there's an equal population. Europe had just as many people as the Americas did. It's pretty even. And those American tribes got depopulated is the scientific word, but basically genocide.
I heard that when that happened, the absence of all the bonfires caused a mini ice age in Europe or something crazy like that. 'Cause
I don't think so. I don't know. I'd have to look at the climate history, but I don't know much about the climate history. But I don't think there's been that kind of cooling in the past 1,000 years. Again, I have to look it up.
this is what I read.
Yeah. Well, there's all kinds of things out there on the internet. But no, we can get sidetracked into those conversations forever. Another thing they do, Taizong leads his government in doing. They're still sometimes getting attacked by these what on this map is called the nomadic peoples, but which we've called the Mongolians or the Xiongnu many times before in talking about China so far this semester. Still attackers that come across the desert and try to hit northern Chinese areas, even though the wall is still there. Taizong didn't like that, so he sent his military into the desert to attack them in their own homelands. And the textbooks and documentaries and whatnot will say that Taizong made those nomadic peoples, those Xiongnu, into his vassals. That's a difficult word to understand because vassal is a European term. A vassal is like if I'm a big landowner and you're all my peasant serfs, then you are my vassals. I have control over you through land. Does that make sense? So I personally don't like that the textbooks use that word. It's more like he negotiated a peace where he had the upper hand over them. but he never really controls them because they can always just retreat further north, further into the desert and the Mongolian plains. And the Chinese probably didn't have the military capacity to invade that far north and really control them. Does it make sense? So to me, it's more of a kind of negotiated peace. But of course, a lot of this comes from Chinese government sources, and of course they're going to say, we dominate them, we control them to make their own leaders look good. Does that make sense? Yeah. Strength in politics, or at least the image of having strength, is often something that gets people to support certain governments or certain leaders. That's why if you watch presidential debates or something, are they ever going to talk about, oh, the enemy did something to us and then we backed down and we negotiated peace? They will almost never say anything like that. It's always, they made a demand and then we hit them hard and we destroyed them and now we control them. Almost never hear terms of or language of weakness coming from especially presidential candidates in the United States. It's always about strength and attack and control. Does that sound familiar? Yeah. Other things Taizong does. Realize that an efficient civil service was one of the things that especially the Han Empire relied on for long-term stability. Just run a really efficient, useful government that keeps the people happy and keeps them fairly well provided for, at least stable. And that convinces people that there's no need to rise up in revolution. So it's actually a really useful, good thing to have good government. Because if people think their government is useful or doing good things for them, then they don't get involved in protest movements or revolutions. Does that make sense? No? Yeah. And that's why opposition politicians from other parties that are out of power, they always talk about how chaotic things are because they want to embarrass the party in power to get you to vote for them or start a revolution against them or something. So you can notice those trends, not just in the United States, but all around the world. And another thing Taizong did, which is pretty extraordinary in the ancient world, is officially tolerated religious minorities. He himself appeared to have been Confucius. But he didn't enforce that upon all the Chinese people. And did not try to eradicate the other religious or philosophical movements that are floating around in China. So Taizong learned from Chinese history. He learned from the strengths of the Han Empire and also the weaknesses of the Qin dynasty. And the big weakness is that it was so heavy-handed in trying to eradicate Confucianism and teaching of history and all these kinds of things that the people ended up hating that government. They overthrew it within one generation. Does that make sense? So Taizong's a pretty smart guy, and he stays in office, and eventually he dies, and his inheritors take over, and the Tang Empire continues for really quite a long time. So skipping beyond his lifetime, about 100 years really quick, getting into the 700s, just like with the old Mandate of Heaven argument, the government starts off really good, or at least efficient, has the people on its side, and over years and decades and generations, things get a little worse and a little worse and a little worse, to the point where maybe 50 or 60 years later, you just have a government that the people don't support anymore. They think that the people leading the government are corrupt or debauched or heretical or whatever your complaint is against the leadership. And you get a series of revolts throughout the 700s. The biggest one hits in 755, where they try to overthrow the entire government and destroy the monarchy itself. Assassinate the leaders. The Tang leadership in the 750s survives that giant revolt, but only through mass repression and bloodshed. So the government survives, but it doesn't have really the people on its side ever after that again. People don't trust the government, they're just they're so repressed that they think there's not much they can do about it, and they wait for another good opportunity to fight back. So the government survives, but it's extremely weakened in terms of its power within China and its ability to project power to other areas. But I think the final Tang collapses in 907. And you get another large era of different warring kingdoms all over China. The landowners go back at it, and they raise their own private militias, and they start infighting again and try to knock each other out to become the next dynasty. And it goes on for another few decades.
What was Confucianism again?
The ideas from Confucius that society should be ordered according to humanity and civility, and that you should respect your elders and the people in higher social positions than you.
Yet he overthrew his dad.
Well, Confucius did.
Punked him.
Oh,
Or he said-
yeah, Taizong does, but politicians are like that sometimes. They'll say one thing outwardly and they do other things. They'll make promises to you all day long, but if they don't think they need to, if you don't bring pressure on them, they often just won't fulfill the promises. So you can watch that effect play out in almost any election, at least in the United States. Throughout the campaign, promises, all these great things we're going to do if I win the election. And after the election, well, those promises just kind of disappear. And the winning candidate never really talks about that stuff anymore, sometimes. Or sometimes they only focus on one promise. And if they achieve it, they say, oh, I did everything that I promised during the campaign. Does that make sense? And you can watch that play out, especially in presidential elections because they're so heavily publicized. I mean, during the campaign, just make a list of the promises. Just take out a piece of paper. And every time you hear the candidate saying, we want to do this, we want to do this, just write them down on a piece of paper and go back to that a year later. Look to see what they're actually doing or what they've actually done. Oftentimes, there's big differences in those lists. Does that make sense? It's pretty easy to track. All you got to do is just read the news on a daily basis. But back in China in the 900s, there's a lot of infighting, landowners attacking each other all over the place. One of the biggest sources of stability is actually in the northern area that becomes known as the Khitan Empire, which are basically some foreign forces coming in and taking over a big chunk of the northern area of China. So a lot of the landowners in the south, they view the Khitans as basically foreigners. Before the Song Empire gets built up, this is all just chaotic. But a lot of the mainstream Chinese landowners don't trust the Khitans at all and view them as a foreign enemy, someone to be feared. Eventually, though, you do get this Song Empire that emerges. This comes out of one of the more northern landowners, has a general. The general overthrows his own landowner and then starts reconquering other neighboring kind of northern kingdoms, and eventually, over many years, is able to extend his control all the way to the southern areas of China and proclaims himself the leader of a new dynasty called the Song Dynasty. And he takes the throne name of Taisu. And again, whenever we say the word reunify in history, even modern history, it's often it's not like you say, oh, let's all be unified again, and then everyone else agrees. You often have to attack them and sometimes kill them, kill their families in order to get people to agree to give up and allow themselves to be controlled by you. Does that make sense? So reunification is a nice word that often means conquest and sometimes genocide. Question?
When you say they pick up their name, Is that randomly chosen or is that the birth name?
No, these are usually not birth names. These names usually have they have some kind of like cultural importance.
Oh.
They name themselves after a certain word that is very honorable in the language or something like that. Or sometimes they name themselves after places. But it's just like today, if you watch monarchies today, a lot of times the heirs to the throne are born with certain names, and when they get to the throne, they change their name. And that's happened in British history. The current British queen has been queen since the 50s. But her father's, when he was born, what was his name? I can't ever remember.
He changed it because of the war. No, is that what you're talking about?
Huh?
His last name? How he changed
Even his first name. What was his name? It started with a C. It was like Clarence or something. It's like some kind of nerdy. But when he got to the throne, he changed it and called himself King George. Because there's been a lot of King Georges in British history, and so they like that name in that family, and George sounds like a much stronger name. Does that make sense? All right. One of the things that Taizu especially did, or he has many levels of impact, obviously, on the government. He's a very powerful emperor. One of the things he did is he learned from Taizong, from the Tang dynasty, and also learned from the Han at the same time, and brought back their same solution to how to rebuild government efficiency. And that is to give a test to people who want to become government employees. You have to show that you have the knowledge to actually do the job. So if you want to be one of the big head tax collectors for the government, you have to know something about mathematics and accounting. So they create these civil service exams that we've seen pop up, especially since the Han Empire, several times in Chinese history, because it's such a good idea. It works. Does that make sense? If you want to be one of the big bridge builders, you have to pass a test to show that you know something about engineering or architecture, or I don't know, nothing about bridge building, so what do most people study? Or if you want to be one of the big generals, you have to pass a test on military tactics and all kinds of things. Does that make sense? The exams, though, under Taizu and under the Song Empire, or the Song Dynasty, became extremely rigorous. I mean, they became obsessed with testing people to the point that it's an estimated only 1 or 2% at most of the people taking the test passed the thing. 98% failure rate. So that's a tough test, right? That's like if I give you a test of 100 questions, you can only get 2 wrong. That's pretty extraordinary. So because the test was so difficult, it's not like a random person could just walk in there, or you could, but you couldn't just logically walk in there and take the test. You have to study for many, many years. Does that make sense? To build up the knowledge base to actually pass the damn thing. And that means that if you're going to spend all your time studying this stuff for a few years preparing for the test, that means that you have to either be from a rich family or you have to have rich friends to give you enough money so you can have a house and have food and all the resources you need while you're studying for the test. Because you're not working. Does it make sense? And there's no government loans or anything out there like you could get today to go to school. Is that clear? So a lot of the people at first passing the test are the ones that come from rich families, big landowning families, because they're the ones that have all this extra money to spend on whatever they want. So this becomes an investment for these rich families to get some of their kids into these kind of levels of schooling, or to have private tutors or something to get them to be able to pass the test so you can get your kid into the government. But the problem for this is that when the tests are that difficult, really only the rich people have enough money and resources to educate their children. And so the rich, over time, take over the government. The rich, though, are smart enough then and today to realize that, if you ever run into a college student who comes from a rich family, a lot of times they just don't work very hard because they figure they're from a rich family. They don't have to work very hard. So a lot of times it's poorer students or students from a poor background that are the real hard workers and have the ambition and they really strive to get to where they want to go. And the wealthy landowning families ain't stupid. They understand that. So a lot of times, a rich landowning family that doesn't trust their own kids to pass the test and get into government, they will look around their area for like the children of the poor peasants. And if there's like an extraordinarily intelligent or hardworking kid that they take notice of, sometimes they'll bring it into the landowning family and almost like adopt that kid and make a deal with that kid saying, we'll pay for your education year after year so you can pass the test and get into government. And a lot of times that kid will intermarry into that family. Does that make sense? Because that family wants talent. They want hard work, striving ambition. Because that's what gets you into government and into the levers of power that these wealthy people want to control. Does it make sense?
So there's not a lot of corruption going on? Can't they just pay out?
Well, there's corruption, but I mean, corruption is heavily punished under the Song Dynasty. But it's not corruption through bribery. It's corruption through like patronage, where the governing bodies are each attached to these different landowning families, and they, part of the deal is when you get into the government, you're going to do favors for the family through tax breaks or government contracts or whatever the family is trying to get for itself. So there's that corruption, but it's not always money based. It's not always bribery. At least bribing government officials. They've already been bribed. They've already been bought. Just the fact that they passed the test. Does that make sense? So the textbooks will say that they'll give you this interesting term called the scholar gentry. Scholar meaning someone who's studied a long time and has like this big knowledge base, right? Gentry means the landowners. And that gentry might not always be heavily educated. They might have just inherited from their parents. Does that make sense? But it's these scholar gentry that have the money behind them from the landowning family, and sometimes they're intermarried into that family by this point. They also have the knowledge base from the years of study, and they're in the government. So they have 3 different sources of power, and they become the main kind of like power blocks within Song China. So in a lot of ways, the kind of similar way that the Roman government was kind of corrupted from within. These scholar gentry tend to dominate Song China. And whenever a reform proposal is made to try to break up their power, they resist it. They kill it. Does that make sense? So that would be like, going to Congress and saying, why don't you pass a law to stop all this money that you have to raise on campaigns? Members of Congress mostly don't want to do that because they were the best at it. That's why they won their elections, right? So altering the system that they use to get into power, they don't want that. They want to keep that system in place. Does that make sense? It's like the people who win marathon races, they don't want to alter the rules of the race. They're the last ones who want to alter the rules because they use those rules to win. Does that make sense? And it's self-interest. It's just a political and economic self-interest. They're in power and they want to keep it that way. So you often see textbooks and documentaries talking about this scholar gentry, and it's really important to understand like how they're manipulating these 3 different methods of power. And you can see in a lot of different governments, even up into our own time. So that's just all coming out of the test that he started to implement. Another thing that he did was to realize that a lot of these dynasties are brought down by revolutions from within. These landowners build up armies and they take down the central government. So a really interesting thing is Taizu hit on the same idea that was successful in the Roman Empire. Build up a fairly large imperial Chinese-wide army, then split it up, send it to all the localities, and give each locality a general, and then rotate the generals around every few months so they can't get the allegiance of their troops. And they can't make political deals with local landowners. And it worked really well for many decades. So even though Taizu had never even probably heard of Augustus or Vespasian or those other Roman emperors that used that theory, is just a logical theory to stay in control, to keep your enemies separated and out of communication with each other, to stop revolutions from forming. And also developed or used an old Chinese kind of trick that I think the Qin dynasty had used to convince the big landowners to keep a residence, a house in the capital city, which is expensive, and it basically drains their bank accounts so they can't afford to start revolutions. They don't have enough money to pay troops to overthrow the government. The third big thing that he did was to end the former Chinese policy, especially in the Tang Empire or the Tang Dynasty, of attacking northward and trying to destroy the Xiongnu in their own homelands. Instead, Taizu basically wants to negotiate with them and even pay them to stop attacking northern China. And those payments are usually on a yearly basis. You pay the attackers or the possible attackers in the springtime, give them a bunch of money so they don't attack you this year. That becomes known as tribute. That's often a European term, but some textbooks use it even for discussing China. Does that make sense? So it's almost like a yearly kind of government tax payment to avoid being attacked. And many European governments have used that method to avoid warfare as much as they possibly can. So Song China will kind of stay in power for quite a long time. It's also growing economically and developing. It's not just getting more farmland or anything like that. They're developing new, even manufacturing methods. And a lot of historians argue that Song China, by around the year 1000 or 1100, somewhere around there, is capable of starting an industrial revolution. Which is basically the transition from human labor to make things, like muscle labor to make clothes, to knit clothes, to transition that to machines for mass production. Does it make sense? And this doesn't actually happen until Britain gets going on it 600 years after this, in the 1700s. And when Britain started doing that, Britain started making so much stuff and selling it all over the world that they made so much money, Britain became the most powerful country in the world virtually overnight. And stayed that way for at least 100 years. And used that wealth to conquer a lot of the rest of the world. So for historians to say that Song China has all the kind of major building blocks of starting an industrial revolution is a big, big statement. So just a few of them. They have internal government stability. The Song dynasty is very powerful, has a very efficient government, a monarchy that's really even obsessed with efficiency. They have transportation networks. They've rebuilt the roads. They've built canals so they can move stuff around throughout their society fairly easily compared to other comparative societies of their time. They have a lot of big cities. China by 1100 will have 100 million people in it. And the United States doesn't get 100 million people in it until about the year 1900. So Song China has one of the biggest world populations, and therefore they have several cities that have maybe 100,000 residents in it. These are gigantic cities. These would have been bigger than any European city at that time, and far bigger, 2 or 3 times as big as any European city. So they have a massive population. A lot of the population is centralized in these cities, which means if someone figures out how to make machines, they have a large labor force in these cities that they could bring into, if they start building factories, making them into factory workers. And it's just there, just ready to go. The Chinese also have a growing kind of internal domestic economy because they have this giant booming population. They also have large growing foreign markets because they're making contact, again, with Korea, Southeast Asia, Turkestan, even Japan. So they have more potential customers out there to sell stuff to if they can figure out how to produce things on a massive scale. Does that make sense? So it seems like the inspiration, the motivation that got the English to start making factories, just sell a bunch of stuff to a bunch of people and make a whole lot of money. That possibility is already there for Song China much, much earlier. And because they have so many more people, they have to feed them all, so they have a growing food supply. Largely because they start importing a different breed of rice from Southeast Asia, especially from today's Vietnam. And this rice grows twice as fast as the native Chinese rice, which means they grow twice as much food per year. So the food supply, the resource, keeps up with the population growth. And if you have so much more food being grown on the same farms, you don't need as many people to be farmers. So some of them can go into innovation, more scientific type of labor. So they seem to have all the little necessities that historians say that Britain later has in the 1700s, and that's what gets Britain going in Industrial Revolution. So a lot of historians ask, why didn't Song China get going on this? Because if they did, world history could have been very, very different. And there's a big reason that we're speaking English all the way out here in California, in the American West Coast, right? It's because the British had the money and the power to start conquering big parts of this continent. If the Chinese had started that 600 years earlier, the Chinese could have been the center of world power for centuries. And the history of colonization and language and culture and all kinds of things could be very, very different. Does that make sense? So this is one of the giant questions in human history. Why didn't Song China do it? Instead of making coins out of metal and stringing them on strings, they start making money out of paper, which means it's lighter, it's easier to carry, which means you can carry a whole lot more money around in your pocket, which means you can buy larger quantities of stuff. Does it make sense? More stuff is sold, the economy grows. And the records we have indicate that they even started making like bank accounts as we know them today. Checking accounts, where you can write out on a piece of paper, here's something that the bank will pay you this much in my name, because I have an account with that bank. Does it make sense? You guys write checks still ever? No? Okay, well, that's from a bygone era, I guess. They started making savings accounts with interest rates. They started making even business accounts that people who want to invest to start a new company can get an account at a bank and put a bunch of their money kind of pooled together in. They start making withdrawals off that account to start buying up resources for their business. So a lot of the kind of modern banking system is innovated in China at this time. And it's all for economic growth. There's money to be made. And the totals of the amount of money being saved and used and spent and moved around start getting so large that they basically invent an ancient style calculator called the abacus, which calculates large numbers by tens, basically. But that comes out of China. Other innovations. They invent new kinds of boats for at least their own history. They start making basically ships that have multiple masts. Mast is this big thing in the middle, this big kind of wooden rod that sticks straight up and holds a sail. So if you make ships that have many masts, that means you have many sails on the boat, right? It harnesses more wind, it moves faster, it moves farther. Because if you're going faster now than you ever had before, you can bring a similar amount of food on your boat, and if you're going faster every day, it means you can travel further and make it back without starving to death. Does that make sense? So the Chinese start exploring away from their own coastline. This is where they start contacting Japan and other places by sea. And some historians estimate that they even make it all the way out into the Indian Ocean, getting closer to India in their explorations. One reason they go so far away from China is they, at this point, also invent a magnetic compass. And that's important because without a compass, You guys ever been on a boat like off of LA or something and get out into the ocean a few miles, and what happens?
Can't do work.
You can't see the land anymore, right? It gets smaller and smaller, then it kind of disappears over the horizon. And if you don't have a compass and you can't tell which direction the land is anymore, you could get turned around really easily. So if you don't have a compass, boats tend to stay within sight of land so they know how to make it back home. Because if you make a wrong turn, you end up heading out into the open ocean. That's where you die, right? That's where you starve to death because you don't have enough food anymore, or fresh water or anything like that. So when you get a compass, you can go further away from the land and still tell which direction is north and how to get back home. Does that make sense? And that's where you start seeing more and more seaborne explorations. People getting on boats and going all over the place. So the Chinese invent that first. They make contact with India, and a lot of Indians learn about the compass, and then it spreads further into kind of old Persia and the Middle East. And the Islamic empires will adapt this and make it much more powerful. Same with other things. The Chinese are also the first to invent a printing press. So instead of the ancient method of making a book is to hire someone to write out every word in that book by hand. That takes a long time, right? So if you want to publish a book that's 200 pages long, you have to hire a bunch of, they call them scribes, to write down every single word over and over and over again to make a book. That means you have to pay all these guys day after day after day. So books are expensive, right? Because if you're paying that big of a labor force to make a book, then you have to sell that book for a lot of money in order to make a profit off of it. Does that make sense? So before the printing press, books are literally worth their weight in gold. That's how much money it took to buy a book. Because it took so much time and effort and specialized laborers to physically create the book. When you get a printing press, the very first one is basically like, they'll take all the words that you want on a page, or the image or whatever you want on the page, and they'll carve it into a piece of wood, and they just dip that piece of wood into some ink and just slam it onto a piece of paper. Get an instant copy. It takes time to carve that into a wood block, but it's much faster than having one person write out every single word over and over and over again. Does that make sense? No? So this is the first, what we start to think of as a printing press. And obviously, it starts off with like 10-page books or something. You just have to make 10 wood blocks and dip in an ink, and boom, 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 boom. Now you put a book together. That means you only have to pay a couple workers to make that book. That means you can sell that book for a lower price and you Walmart the competition. Does that make sense? So this took off, and you start to see a huge amount of stuff being printed in China. There's more knowledge spreading because there's more books to read. More people learn to read because books are cheaper. People with less and less money can now afford to buy at least one book and try to learn to read. So literacy rates in China compared to the rest of the world have skyrocketed at this point. And again, now that they're making contact with other civilizations, especially Indians and the Islamic empires will take on that idea too, and they launch off on printing much larger books, often at government expense. And the Chinese are the first to invent gunpowder as we now know it. We think that they first used it for fireworks, like celebration. I think it goes up in the sky and makes a lot of noise or spreads a bunch of pretty colors or something. The Chinese later made it into early forms of like grenades and cannon to use on the battlefield to win wars. And again, when that idea made contact with the Islamic empires, they'll develop and build big cannonball-based cannons. And, they'll be the most powerful armies on the planet for several hundred years, until the Europeans start to catch up in the 1600s, but that's history too. As in the second series of world history. So questions about that? There's tons of innovation going on in all kinds of different fields in Song China for centuries. So why don't they create an industrial revolution? They seem to be on the edge of this idea of mass production of things. Why don't they apply it to machines? One argument that historians give is that they actually get involved in a really destructive war. And that stops them. So there's this northern Khitan Empire that the Songs are still afraid of. They view the Khitans as foreigners, basically. The Khitan in their own area, way up in the northeast, they have a kind of minority in that area called the Jurchens. And the Jurchens started a revolt against the Khitan. Does that make sense? And the Songs love it. So the Songs decide to send money and weapons to the Jurchens in order to take down what the Songs feel are their bigger enemy, the Khitan. Is that clear? Basically figuring the enemy of my enemy is my friend. The Songs see the Khitan as an enemy, so they'll give resources to anyone that wants to fight the Khitan. Knock them out. Is that clear? It's called geopolitics. We talked about that in here before? No? The geography of politics? Why I hate the Yankees? No? Okay. Put this very simply. My favorite baseball team is the one in Tampa Bay. And they're in the same division with the Yankees. Therefore, I hate the Yankees because the Yankees have a bunch of money and they tend to knock my favorite team out of the playoffs every year. Does that make sense? So I always root against the Yankees, just like the Song to root against the Khitan. So when the Yankees play against Minnesota or Texas or Oakland or Seattle or any other team, who do I root for in those games? The other team. Because I like Minnesota or Seattle? No. Why do I root for them?
Because
you don't like the Yankees.
Because they can hurt my enemy for a few days at least. I don't really care about those other teams, but they're useful for me for a little while to hurt my vicious enemy. Okay? That's what geopolitics is. That's why the Song support the Jurchens to hurt their bigger enemy, what they view as the bigger threat. And I used to root for the Red Sox all the time to take down the Yankees, and they started taking down the Yankees, but an interesting thing started to happen.
The Red Sox take out your team.
The Red Sox take out my team, and that's exactly what the Khitan do. Or the Jurchens, they eventually win their war against the Khitan and establish this new empire up in the north, and then that empire attacks the Song. The very people who were giving them the help in the first place. So geopolitics often backfires, right? Does that make sense? You can empower someone else who can become an even bigger threat. So now the Red Sox are a giant pain in the ass.
Did the other empire before the Jin had a chance to be?
Well, the Jin is the Jurchen. That's them.
No, but the one that was there before, the one they.
Oh, the Khitan?
Yeah.
They're knocked out. They're sent away.
Did the Khitan have a chance to be the Song?
Well, yeah, they attack them every once in a while. And most historians think that the Khitan were actually a lot of Mongolian. So the Song don't like them because they're associated with the Xiongnu, which launch little raids and whatnot. Oh, they've been going for thousands of years. So they're seen as like a historical, cultural enemy. And you can see this geopolitics still operating in the world today. I mean, the United States gives money and weapons to anyone that's willing to fight Iran or today Syria or anyone else that the United States picks out as an enemy. They don't even pay attention to who's doing the fighting. It's just, oh, you want to fight against the Soviets or whoever? Here, take some missiles. And sometimes that backfires. And it has in big ways in your lifetime, right? The United States gave funding to a guy named Bin Laden in the 80s because he was willing to go off and attack the Soviets. And got CIA training in how to avoid being captured. I'm not making it up. It's all proven in the documents. So sometimes that doesn't really work for the long term very well. And ironically, that the United States has given money and weapons to all kinds of different groups to attack enemies of the United States. And that's the one, Bin Laden in the 80s, that's the one they define as the success. Think about that for a few minutes. They say Bin Laden was the successful one. All these other ones we've tried have been failures. Like, that's success? How horrible was the failure? Maybe I'm the only one who laughs at this. You never heard of these things?
Yeah.
So maybe that's something to think about whenever you hear the U.S. government saying, we're going to give money and weapons to this one group because they're going to take down the enemy. Like, wait a minute. You guys learn from your own history?
Failure would be Vietnam.
That's what they say is failure. Yeah, they gave money and weapons to a bunch of people and didn't work.
Lost a lot of people.
So, yep. And killed a lot of people in the process, and something like estimates vary between 2 and 5 million Vietnamese. So, yeah. Which is about 20 times as many people are killed in Vietnam. Vietnamese people were killed in that war as were American soldiers.
20 times?
Yep, for every one American soldier killed in Vietnam, there are 20 Vietnamese people killed. So,
Freedom.
yeah. And the United States acts like it's like a victim in that war somehow. What? But maybe that's just me and my own criticism. But sometimes geopolitics just don't work very well. But they keep trying it, and it's not just the United States trying it. It's countries all over the world trying to knock out their enemies and gain more territory or power or whatever they're after.